Media was undeniable during Public Media Giving Days and Give Big. We are so grateful to everyone who gave. Your generosity keeps KUOW strong. Public media is powered by you. Thanks to you, KUOW's independent news and storytelling remain accessible and available to everyone. Missed your chance to give? There's still time to show your support for public media right now at KUOW.org. And thanks. It is now 61 degrees in South Seattle. Partly sunny this afternoon with an expected high of 68.
Support for On Point comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and from the Mehrotra Institute for Business, Markets, and Society, hosting the Is Business Broken podcast featuring conversations with academics, industry leaders, and politicians. More at ibms.bu.edu. And Viking, dedicated to creating travel experiences for the thinking person with programs designed for cultural enrichment on board and on shore. Learn more at Viking.com.
You're back with On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty, and just a quick note, because it is Friday, I do want to tell all of you to go to our On Point podcast feed, because the latest episode of the Jack Pod has dropped, and that's our weekly conversation with the inimitable Jack Beatty, On Point's news analyst. And in the Jack Pod, he gets we basically give him all the room he needs to run to connect history, literature, and politics in the way only Jack can. And this week, Jack and I talked about what he sees as President Trump's both deliberate ignorance of history and the interesting things that happens when President Trump chooses to remember certain parts of history. The Jackpot is a unique feature in the On Point podcast feed, so definitely check it out. And while you're in our podcast feed, just go ahead and, what is it the young folks say? Smash that subscribe button in the On Point podcast feed. Okay, so let me come back to today's conversation with Tammy Govea. She's the Paul Farmer Professor of Practice at Boston University's School of Social Work, and she is leading a project called Beyond 2025, the Beyond 2025 Action Hub, which is a searchable database on two major documents that came out before the Trump administration began in January 20th. Of course, Project 2025 is one of them, and the other is the America First Agenda. And this database is tracking how closely actions from the current Trump administration are mirrored in those two documents. Essentially, how is this administration following those playbooks? Okay, so Professor Govea, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the places where the administration didn't exclusively follow Project 2025, because we've given a lot of examples of how it has. You had mentioned Head Start before, and Project 2025 definitely, I think, explicitly calls for the elimination of the Head Start program, which was floated by the White House. But what happened there?
Well, with the president's budget, it is included in the president's budget right now. I think, the devil will be in the details of how that it gets rolled out and which version of the budget actually, rises to the top and gets passed. But right now it is included in the president's budget, which was a little bit surprising to a number of folks. And, some are questioning, well, and this is the thing to sort of, I think, for us to be like thinking about and looking at is what's underneath the executive orders, what's underneath, and what's the reason behind some of the language that's included in Project 2025. Because some of these things, you look at it at first blush and you think, well, that makes a lot of sense. But then if you take a step back and have a little bit of skepticism about, but what really is the motivation here? So I have the same sort of reaction to Head Start, which has had bipartisan support. It has been, demonstrated to be one of the things that's been the most successful programs. So it being included in Project 2025 was very confusing, and the original actions against Head Start, was a little bit confusing. And now seeing sort of the retreating around it, you have to sort of wonder, is it a bipartisan? Is it that Republicans have come forward and said, no, we still need this? Or is this perhaps a move towards trying to create more privatization at the local level around childcare? Because we're seeing that in numerous ways, and they have a lot of sections on childcare and moving childcare into the home and smaller childcare-based centers. So you kind of have to wonder, is this part of like that family first approach and putting, conceiving of the nuclear family as a mother or father and a couple of children, and the mom stays home, and is that the move? So it's just a little curious to see where this might go.
Yeah, and just so folks know, again, this is in Project 2025 on page 482. There's a whole paragraph that just starts with eliminate the Head Start program. That's what it calls for. Basically, I think it says the assertion there is waste, fraud, and abuse in the program, although I don't think they really provide a robust data set to support that. And interestingly, in Project 2025, they say research has demonstrated that federal Head Start centers have little to no long-term academic value for children, which my understanding was the research shows the exact opposite.
The exact opposite. Absolutely the exact opposite. Research after research shows the exact opposite. It's one of the most successful anti-poverty and getting students really ready to perform in school. That is the Head Start program. That is what it does. Yeah. And it's succeeded in that.
Well, to your point, though, this is one program that thus far has not been eliminated, even though it looks like the White House kind of made noises about that, but it's pulled back from that effort. And we'll have to find out why as things progress. But you know what I wanted to also ask you about is you had said earlier that it's not just the executive branch or the White House that is reading and echoing what's in these documents in their actions. You said Congress, Republican-led Congress, also is playing a role here. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, we saw even early, the first bill that President Trump signed was the Laken-Riley Act, which is an anti-immigration, anti-immigrant piece of legislation and bill that was signed into law. And that was put forward by the Republican Congress and, moved really swiftly. So that's one example of where Congress has, stepped in and done some of the bidding along with the Trump administration. We see this also now happening with school meals. So school meals and getting rid of universal school meals is also in Project 2025. So we haven't, to my knowledge, seen an executive order specific on school meals, but Congress has proposed making the eligibility requirements a lot more stringent and harder, with the potential impact on 24,000 schools, 12 million students who won't be able to access school meals. So when you think about what allows a student to show up ready to learn, it's having food in their bellies. It's not stressing about whether or not they're going to be able to eat lunch, or if they're going to be able to stand in the lunch line and not feel stigmatized because they don't have the same school meal that some of their peers have. So that's where we're seeing Congress also step in. And then the third place, which is going to require Congress, is making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, which has been part of President Trump's campaign. It's been part of his effort. They passed that during his first administration. And this is where the issues around Medicaid and whether or not Medicaid is stripped of a lot of its funding, which would impact seniors and folks with disabilities, instituting, work requirements. Is that an administration action or is that congressional action? But we do know that Medicaid is on the chopping block, in part because that will actually help fund the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is really a big boon for wealthy individuals and corporations. So that's the role that Congress is playing in all of this. And I think they are getting pressure. We've seen through the town halls that they are getting pressure from their constituents, but we don't know where, a lot of this will end up going in the end.
So the school meals one is actually quite interesting to me because it's not just sort of a practical change that Project 2025 is calling for, but it's also, again, this sort of political philosophy about the role of government, which is interesting here. So I just want to read a little bit about that. In Project 2025, page 302, it says, return to the original purpose of school meals. And it said the original purpose is to provide food to children from low-income families while at school. Okay, there's no doubt about that. But then Project 2025 says, today, federal school meals increasingly resemble entitlement programs and represent an example of the ever-expanding federal footprint in local school operations. And then it says, to serve students in need and prevent the misuse of taxpayer money, the administration should focus on students in need and reject efforts to transform federal school meals into an entitlement program, specifically calling for USDA to clarify who would be eligible
Right.
for school meals and for reject efforts to create universal free school meal programs, which a lot of states have actually done post-COVID.
Yeah. Absolutely, because the research shows that when kids have food in their bellies and they're able to show up and learn, and it reduces the stigma. There's also just such a huge administrative burden that comes along with administering a lot of these programs. So you can put families through all the hoops and they're going to be eligible anyways. Why spend all that extra money on the administrative side when you can actually be helping,
Right.
students be prepared to learn by accessing nutritious food. And that's the other thing that they've also called for is, changing the nutrition standards in schools and allowing for more processed food. And it also will disrupt, a number of schools have these really great partnerships with their local farms. We know that there's been real impact on farmers in various parts of the country because of the tariffs and because of the disruption with USAID. For those who aren't tracking this, it's, a lot of times farmers in the United States are actually the ones that are selling food or providing food to other parts of the world. And so the elimination of USAID has really had an impact on farmers here in the United States. And this is another area that will impact local farmers who have these really great partnerships. So again, you're talking about disrupting the local food ecosystem, even beyond just what's happening with the schools. So these things are just so interconnected, it's hard to not get into them.
Yeah, and what's connecting them all again is this belief of what is the role of the federal government. And for a lot of Project 2025 and the America First agenda, it's basically like the government should be less involved in people's lives. The government should see universal school meals as an entitlement program that taxpayer dollars shouldn't support. Step back, federal government. That's kind of the philosophy here. But there's well, I was going to say, yeah, but there's a whole other part or multiple parts of these documents that call for even more involvement in the federal government in people's lives. And I'm wondering, we should talk about that regarding like the whole concept of families in America and how what we see in Project 2025 and America First, the America First agenda might evolve into actual actions by the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, I think this piece around the family is something that I would encourage folks to take a look at because it is more government intrusion into the ways that people choose to live their lives, whether they choose to have children or when or not. For some of the requirements for access to some of the programs that for like TANF, right? So temporary assistance for needy families and having requirements around the role of the father in the situation. The fact is that, sometimes that could put women and children in greater harm, maybe perhaps due to domestic violence. And if we really care about families and making sure that families are able to succeed, let's look at access to health care. Let's look at access to living wage. Let's make it easier to get access to childcare and to higher education. And what we're doing is with Project 2025 and the Trump administration is rolling back all of those things that have really helped families be successful and be able to thrive, and now have this other imposition into our lives around, what does a nuclear family really look like and what does it consist of?
So does Project 2025 go so far as to define what the government should see as what a family is?
I think they do pretty clearly, talking about that there's some language in there around, we all know that the best American family is one that includes a mother and father. So they're pretty clear about what their conception of a traditional or an ideal family looks like in the country. And they've even gone so far as to say, well, if there's an incarcerated parent, then the incarcerated parent will actually get more of the services so that they can do education while they're incarcerated, rather than looking at it as a both and really supporting the family and being able to be successful. So the choices they're making are very obvious about who they think is deserving and who is less deserving, depending on if you fit the mold that they conceive of as the appropriate or traditional or ideal family state.
Well, I'm looking here at the chapter on the Department of Health and Human Services, to your point, and it actually, Project 2025 calls for 3 major goals in HHS's even core mission, I'd say. When it says goal number 1, protecting life, conscience, and bodily integrity. 2, empowering patient choices and provider autonomy. And 3, regarding families, goal number 3, this is on page 451 of the version of Project 2025 that I have, promoting stable and flourishing married families. And it says families comprised of a married mother, father, and their children are the foundation of a well-ordered nation. That's interesting. And healthy society. Unfortunately, many family policies and programs under Biden's HHS are fraught with agenda items focused on, and they put this in quotes, LGBTQ plus equity, subsidizing single motherhood, disincentivizing work, and penalizing marriages. Then Project 2025 says these policies should be repealed and replaced by policies that support the formation of stable, married, nuclear families. And I mean, it sounds like the specific programs you're talking about could actually be changed.
Nope.
In order to, I don't think this goal can actually be achieved necessarily, but to try to advance that goal.
I absolutely think that they will make moves to do that if they haven't already, or if they're not like planning it within, whether it's Congress or some future executive order. We did see the Trump administration back off a little bit, or actually ask the court to dismiss a case that's in federal court around mifepristone. Not really exactly sure what that means. You know, some folks are saying, oh, that means that he's backing off of mifepristone. He's backing off of some of these family first policies. I don't think that's the case. I think there's probably something a little bit more strategic that's happening in that space, and really relegating the decision making to the state level. So with like TANF and some of the other programs, they want to create them, like push them really at the state level back to that federal piece, except for they still want to be able to say, well, this is how it ought to be conceived of. So I think they're trying to have a both and. We're backed off, but we're still going to tell you how it has to go.
It's interesting because the Project 2025, it talks explicitly about the federal government should not subsidize single motherhood, but then it also calls for a child support tax credit for fathers who are non-resident with their children, or the mothers of their children. It says the key to that policy is it empowers fathers with their own resources and money, rather than creating another government assistance program. But it's essentially a government assistance program for non-resident fathers.
Right. It's diverting some of that funding too that would normally go to the mom and her children if she's not living with the father. So that's part of the issue that I see, is that we're going to see it get even more difficult for single-headed households, which I've been a single-headed household. I understand how to navigate not exactly these programs, but what the challenges are in you know, trying to raise your family on lower dollars. And this is about shifting the dollars to the dads.
Well, I think the overall lesson from your work and today's hour is believe what's in Project 2025 and the America First agenda, because it is actually being enacted in several ways. And you can go to the database that Professor Gouveia is helping to build. We have a link to it at onpointradio.org. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from Seed. Seed's DSO1 is a 24-strain 2-in-1 probiotic and prebiotic engineered to survive digestion, support healthy regularity, and promote whole body health. Learn more at seed.com/public. And BetterHelp, committed to making mental well-being a priority and offering support in taking on everything life demands, with therapists available to communicate via video, chat, or phone at betterhelp.com/public.
KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. Well, it's Friday again, and it's almost noon. That means it's almost time for KUOW's Week in Review. Here's Bill Radke.
I got you. We're going to discuss how the UW is handling the latest campus protests over its ties to Israel. Should Washington State be able to require a priest, say, to report child abuse that he learns about in confession? If a city councilor has a conflict of interest, should they be able to vote or just tell you that they have a conflict of interest? Also, the Gates Foundation says they're going to wind it down, and we're going to discuss all that and give you something to smile about. And if you don't stay tuned, it'll just all be for naught. So I really hope you'll listen.
63 degrees in South Seattle, where the forecast is for a partly sunny afternoon and a high of 68.
Support for KUOW comes from the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival, returning to downtown Seattle on Saturday, May 31st. A full day of live podcast and TV recordings with Radiolab, Criminal, The Gist, and more. Tickets and more information available at cascadepbs.org/festival.
As Swedish author Fredrik Backman was writing his latest book, he was seriously considering retiring. The demands of promoting his work were taking too much out of him.
Maybe I should go and see if there's something else that I could do that would make me a happier and a little more balanced individual.
I'm Ari Shapiro. Fredrik Backman on feeling like a fraud despite his success on the next All Things Considered from NPR News.
All Things Considered begins this afternoon at 3 o'clock on KUOW 94.9, Seattle's NPR news station.
Support for KUOW comes from STG, presenting Louie, a silent film with live accompaniment by Wynton Marsalis at the Paramount on May 28th. Featuring a live 11-piece jazz ensemble, the film tells the story of a boy born into poverty who dreams of playing the trumpet. Tickets and more at stgpresents.org.
Live from NPR News, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The U.S. Postal Service's Board of Governors has picked an official at one of its competitors to lead the independent federal mail agency. As NPR's Hansi Lo Wong tells us, the move comes as USPS, which is a financial supporter of NPR, faces an uncertain future under the Trump administration.
David Steiner, a former CEO of Waste Management, is set to leave the board of FedEx to start leading the U.S. Postal Service in July. In a statement, Steiner says he believes strongly in maintaining the Postal Service's role as an independent establishment of the executive branch. In recent months, the Trump administration has sparked concerns that it's determined to take over an agency that Congress set up to be independent decades ago. President Trump has suggested a, quote, form of a merger between the Commerce Department and the Postal Service, as well as privatizing USPS, which would likely reduce mail service in rural communities. The heads of the two letter carrier unions say they're concerned about the incoming Postmaster General's background at FedEx, which they fear could lead to USPS selling off the package side of its mail business and sidelining unions. Hansi Lo Wong, NPR News, Washington.
Retired Supreme Court Justice David Souter has died. He was a Republican administration nominee, but he disappointed conservatives as he aligned himself with his liberal colleagues. One of the most notable cases was the 5-4 ruling that determined the outcome of the 2000 presidential election. George W. Bush prevailed over Al Gore. Souter was among the dissenters after he and his colleagues heard and responded during arguments.
There is no genuinely subjective indication beyond what can be viewed as either a dimple or a hanging chad, and there is a general rule being applied in a given county that an objective intent or an intent on an objective standard will be inferred.
Souter served 19 years. He passed away yesterday at his New Hampshire home at the age of 85. The Trump administration is expelling transgender troops from the military. NPR's Quill Lawrence reports this comes after the Supreme Court allowed a ban to be enforced while a legal challenge proceeds.
One of President Trump's first executive orders declared that trans troops were not fit to serve, though trans people have deployed to combat and served openly starting in 2016. The ban drew legal challenges, but the Supreme Court ruled that it can stand while those cases play out. Now, the Pentagon says about 1,000 openly trans service members will be removed, and medical records will be used to kick out other troops who have had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. The total number of trans people in the military is believed to be under 5,000, about 0.2% of the force. Advocates say transgender Americans have served honorably and effectively and called the ban irreparably harmful to them and to U.S. security. Quill Lawrence, NPR News.
You're listening to NPR.
This is KUOW News. I'm Sammy West in Seattle. Seattle's Mopop could become the National Museum of Pop Culture if Washington's congressional delegation get their way. A bipartisan group led by Representatives Dan Newhouse and Pramila Jayapal introduced the bill. It would designate the 25-year-old institution as a national museum. Mopop houses more than 85,000 rare items, from Kurt Cobain's sweater to Greedo's mask from Star Wars. The museum says it gets about 750,000 visitors a year. And while the number of visitors to Seattle and King County continues to grow, it's not yet back to its pre-pandemic heights. Tammy Canavan is the CEO of Visit Seattle, a group that promotes Seattle area tourism. She says they're tracking some concerning trends, including anecdotal reports of a drop in Canadian visitors, who make up the largest block of international tourists.
While we saw increases 24 over 23, we're still in recovery mode. So that does make sort of any fall off that we see in international visitation that more concerning.
Canavan says international tourists stay longer and spend more. Domestic and international visitors pumped $8.8 billion into the local economy last year and generated 68,000 jobs. Canavan says they're working on making international visitors feel more welcome. And 2 new East Side light rail stations are coming online tomorrow. Sound Transit is adding stations in downtown Redmond and Marymore Village, which add about 3.5 miles of new rail. Riders will be able to go from downtown Bellevue to Marymore Village in about 15 minutes. Opening day tomorrow will feature live music, food trucks, and other family-friendly activities at both stations. Officials say the East Side line is expected to connect to the One line in Seattle later this year. And this is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from BetterHelp, committed to making mental well-being a priority and offering support in taking on everything life demands, with therapists available to communicate via video, chat, or phone at betterhelp.com/public.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. My name is Bill Radke. Now, if you already get Dyer Oxley's newsletter every day, maybe you say, well, I know enough about the news, but I don't know, Dyer. No offense. I mean, you do a great job. You are the KUOW's online editor and producer. I love your newsletter. I read it every morning.
Thank you.
But I still like I like to hear Week in Review, where people get together, we discuss, we debate, right?
Yeah.
We're still
respectfully disagree.
Respectfully. We're going to disagree respectfully. Dyer's also on the Meet Me Here podcast, brand new podcast on KUOW.
Covering pop culture.
Pop culture, what's going on in the area. You can get that wherever podcasts come from. Also with us, Saul Gamoran, founder and president of Gamoran Legal Consulting. Welcome back, Saul.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Happy to be here.
Glad you're here. And there's another local podcast called Seattle Nice. And that's where I get to hear Erica Barnett. And it's just not enough, Erica. And I need you on here every once in a while, if you could.
You can also read me on Publicola.
On Publicola, yes. More importantly, co-founder of Publicola?
Co-founder, with Josh Veit.
Bring that up a little bit, toward that microphone up a little bit, would
Absolutely.
you? Okay. By the way, is anybody allergic to pollen on this panel?
Yes.
Are you?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you seem okay. How are you doing?
I'm drugged up.
So, are you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Wow. Because there's such this gap between how much pollen matters to, I forget the word. I don't think of the word pollen all year. And then I hear this time of year, I hear people for whom it seems to dominate their lives.
You got to time it out. You got your tree pollens, you got your grass pollens, you got the random pollens that I don't know about. They all kind of show up at different times and wreak havoc in different ways.
Oh, I feel for you. The state health department said this week that pollen season now starts almost 3 weeks earlier than it did 30 years ago, and it lasts about a month longer. That's not what you wanted to hear, but that's just reality.
Yeah, thanks for bringing me down.
Okay, shall we just talk about what happened this week? And invite listeners, by the way, if you want to go on to YouTube, then you can watch the show because we're streaming live there. Okay, time for the Week in Review, and our first topic is that this week campus protesters were at the University of Washington. They barricaded themselves inside an engineering building and demanded that the UW stop taking money from Boeing because the company sells weapons to Israel. Some of the protesters allegedly damaged property, lit dumpsters on fire, and blocked firefighters' access. Police arrested about 30 people for gross misdemeanor criminal trespassing. And UW banned 34 protesters from campus, suspended 21 students, also banning them from campus. This was not good enough for the Trump administration because the same federal task force that froze funding for Harvard and Columbia universities applauded the arrests and suspensions, but the task force said, we are investigating this protest. And I'll tell you more about what the task force says. But does anybody here think that the UW did anything to keep their federal funding that they would not have done otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of things can be true. I think that the Trump administration is weaponizing the idea of anti-Semitism while, actually being quite anti-Semitic themselves. And so I don't think that it would have protected the university to take any particular action. I do think that, maybe now we're in the crosshairs a little more, we being, Seattle, the University of Washington, and maybe a little faster than we would have been. But I mean, I don't think that the Trump administration's actions have any connection to reality necessarily. I mean, they just don't want any student protest, particularly on the issue of Palestine. And I think more than that, they just want to defund public universities and the education system more broadly.
I have a different perspective. I think, first of all, I don't agree that the president's an anti-Semite. Second thing is, I think the explosion of anti-Semitism after October 7 has been all over the world, but especially in campuses in the United States, including UW. Nobody would have a problem if people were protesting the war. The problem is they're doing it violently and they're intimidating Jewish students, and that's why the Trump administration has gotten so strong on this. I don't think there's any doubt that a Harris administration would not have put the same pressure on universities in this case. And I think that I applaud what you did. They called in the police. I'd like to see them expel the students, not just suspend them. And if felony charges are applicable, I'd like to see them charged with felonies. You're not
saying yet that felony charges are applicable.
No,
because there's been talk about whether this should be not just trespassing misdemeanor charges, but I've heard from some Washington Republicans this is domestic terrorism, and you and I were talking about this a bit. I don't know whether that's a legal argument or just sort of a rhetorical flourish.
I think that's a rhetorical flourish. I don't think there is a crime on the books called domestic terror. If there is, I'm not aware of it. But I would say that, and the police haven't referred the charges yet to the prosecutor's office. But I would say that the idea that it has to do with protesting the war, I strongly disagree with. It has to do with violence. They did over $1 million of damage to the engineering department.
This is the first time since Trump's been in office that they've had a college protest demonstration like this, correct? Before it was last year with Columbia and all that kind of. I feel like this is just feeding ammunition to the Trump administration. They were waiting for this. So whether or not the university did anything, I feel like they were waiting for this and they were just going to jump on it no matter what. Because I don't know if the protesters care much about that or the Trump administration, no Trump administration, but it definitely just feeds right into what they want.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's an argument against protest, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but I mean, I do think that, of course, there are like prosecutable offenses here. I don't disagree with that. I mean, if a random person came onto the UW campus and started lighting things on fire, they would be justified in calling the police. So I'm not defending those actions specifically. But I think that it is not true that the protests, by and large, in other places have been violent. I would kind of dispute that actions against property are violent. That's not the case, in law. But there was, the protesters are alleging that there was violence by the police. And again, I don't know if that was true. I'm just stating what the two sides have said. But I don't think that we can protect ourselves from the Trump administration's actions against higher education by prohibiting protest, for example, or saying that some protests against the war are violent when they are not. But again, in this particular case, I mean, yeah, they were destroying property, they were lighting things on fire. Those things are against the law, and and it is the cops would have come in if it had just been a random person. So I don't think that was unjustified in this case.
This Trump administration task force said, "quote the task force," but they applauded the UW's, everything you said, the suspensions and the police arrests. And said, quote, the task force expects the institution, meaning UW, to follow up with enforcement actions and policy changes that are clearly necessary to prevent these uprisings moving forward and guarantee that Jewish students have a safe and productive learning environment. The task force, as far as I know, did not say what it is they want, they're calling on the UW to do. Any idea what that would be? What else would the UW do?
Well, for example, the UW did nothing about all those illegal encampments last year, despite the fact that if it had been the KKK, they would have disbanded them. But because they were sympathetic to the politics, they just let it go. And what happens is Jewish students have a hard time getting to classes because they're harassed. So I think that's what the Trump administration is talking about.
I think when we're invoking the KKK, we should be very careful and make it applicable to the situation. I mean, in this case, I would say encampments are a form of protest that, has existed for a really long time. College campus protests have existed for a really long time. And I don't think that there is an example of the KKK or, Nazis setting up protest encampments at colleges. But I will say, I think what the Trump administration wants is probably to have, content, just censorship over what the school is allowed to teach and which protests are allowed to go forward. They've shown that with other higher education institutions like Harvard and as well as Columbia. So I'm sure it's the same here.
So the federal government would be waiting for some other protests to happen and compare UW response this to that. I don't know exactly what the Trump administration, what their next move is, what their specific call to action is.
Well, they tried to do content regulation on what can be taught at Columbia and Harvard. So, saying like that woke, DEI stuff is, can't be allowed or they won't get federal funding. I mean, that has been the threat so far.
But as a practical matter, you're not going to see this kind of protest happen again in UW because they finally took action and people were arrested. And that's what they should have done before.
Well, but it's interesting because it's an apple and an orange because we don't have the ability to say what would happen if these protesters kept the same rhetoric, called the October 2023 Hamas killings a heroic victory, which they did. This one group, Super UW, but they didn't damage any property or didn't occupy any buildings. I don't know what the UW would have done in those cases.
I strongly believe the UW would have done nothing.
And what about now?
Oh, now
Under the Trump administration.
I don't know. It's a good question.
I mean, I think that, speech is protected in the United States. And, there are Palestinians protesting Hamas right now. I don't agree with the rhetoric that, we should be celebrating Hamas. But that rhetoric is protected free speech. And to say that the UW should crack down on speech is, that is a very, very steep, very slippery slope.
Well, the question would be, go ahead, Dyer.
That's the thing that's, I think, watching this, reporting the news has always kind of got me is the speech part of it. They have a message to get out. They have a position. They have an opinion. But if you're looking on from the outside, if there's one way to make sure you do not get your message out, there's one way to make sure people do not pay attention to you, do this. I mean, that's kind of a 101 to counter your objective. It reminds me of May Day. Year after year, I would report on May 1st here in Seattle, and I would tell folks I'm going to go report on it, and they would inevitably talk about the nighttime smashing windows and things like that. I'm like, no, the May Day, the march and all that, all the time, nobody knew what I was talking about. They have no idea that there's daytime marches. They have no idea any of that's going on. That's because somebody comes at night, breaks a whole bunch of windows, and that's all anybody pays attention to. So the moment you start setting fires and you start breaking windows, I don't think anybody knows anything of what the protesters are trying to say. They just know they broke windows and they set fires, and that's where their attention goes. So freedom of speech, yes. I don't think it's the most smart or thought out method of getting that message out.
I mean, I think that the things that people pay attention to, and look, I'm guilty of this as well. I mean, I choose what stories to cover, but the things people pay attention to are determined by the media in huge part. Obviously, there's other stuff. There's TikTok. There's, people getting their own information from, people on the ground or, other people who are not in the media. But the media chooses to cover broken windows. And I would say, like in some cases, particularly with some of the TV news, they've covered it quite hysterically. and that is a choice too. And so it's nothing happens.
Would you
in a
rather we were
vacuum.
not talking about it right now?
No, of course we should be talking about it. I think it's very newsworthy, but I also think that that there is a responsibility that we're just kind of skipping a step when we say that people only pay attention to something. Well, they're paying attention to media. They're not going there on the ground and witnessing it for themselves.
I still think it's kind of like promoting your butcher shop at a vegan restaurant. I'm not sure this is the best plan possible to go.
Well, regarding the what's allowed speech and what's not allowed speech, I don't know whether the UW would make this case, but you could imagine a hypothetical where the UW would say, to publicly valorize something like, let's say, the October 2023 Hamas attack, that will have the effect of making Jewish students feel unsafe, feel terrorized, feel they don't have equal access to campus life. I don't know whether that's the argument that would be made, but that's the theory, right?
That's one argument. The other argument is that schools like UW have a code of conduct. So there is not unlimited free speech. You can't get up there and say, we should murder all the blacks in this country. You can't do that at the UW as a student.
But there's a difference between I think there would be a difference between a threat of violence and a commentary on violence.
Well, it depends on specifically what you're saying. But the point is there are limits to free speech on campuses, and that's a good example that you gave.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are men's rights activists that are very, active on many campuses that I would say make women probably feel unsafe walking by, a specific booth or protest or whatever. I mean, this existed when I was in college too. I mean, it's not new that there are views that are, offensive to some people or abhorrent to some people. But I think there is a very big difference in somebody standing up and calling for murder of a racial group and, somebody standing up and saying we support Hamas. I think that there's a difference of kind in a threat and free speech. And and it's true. I mean, universities do have the right to regulate free speech, and I think that, or to regulate speech rather, to some extent. But I think that they should err, as institutes of higher education, on the side of speech rather than prohibiting speech.
When they're saying Sinwar set the bar, that is very intimidating to Jewish students. It's wrong, and they shouldn't be permitted.
Well, last spring, the UW allowed, I guess you could say, there were weeks of protest, including tents in the quad, and at least part of the time occupation or blockading of a couple of buildings. And the UW that only ended after they had some negotiations, and the UW agreed to what I would call relatively, the UW has never said, okay, we'll stop taking money from Boeing. It was much smaller bore. We will, we'll recognize, we'll have some scholarships for displaced Palestinian students. We'll have more transparency about who we take money from. We'll make more connections with Palestinian universities. I remember I was at UW in the 80s when there, for example, were anti-apartheid protests. And I really would have to go back and check my facts. My memory is that the UW back then as well tolerated a certain amount of, disruption and tents. I think it was analogous, and they didn't come in right away and enforce every policy they have.
Yeah, and I mean, and when I was in college, I participated in protests where we did encamp on the quad, where I went to school, and we did occupy, an administrative office for a while. It was over a very different issue, it was environmental, but this is, a long and storied tradition at colleges, and I just think that again, it's a very slippery and very steep slope from saying this speech is prohibited to saying that all kinds of speech that we institutionally disagree with or that are inconvenient for us because of the federal administration is prohibited.
Okay, well, should we pause it there? Do we cover it enough for now? We're waiting to see. You brought up the issue of expulsion. I don't know whether these student suspensions automatically are on a path toward a decision about expulsion. I assume there's a process that's where it's headed unless the UW decides otherwise. We're waiting for the charges for the arrested people, how that's going to be prosecuted. So there's going to be more to say about this UW response to to this week's protests. Also, the Trump administration does not appreciate a new Washington state law that our legislature just passed. We'll discuss that and more after we take a break and we roll on with KUOW's Week in Review.
63 degrees in South Seattle, expecting sun this afternoon and a high of 68. KUOW 94.9 Seattle. It's 12:24.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books. British naturalist Robert Macfarlane discusses his new book, Is a River Alive, with David B. Williams on Thursday, June 12th at 7 p.m. Tickets and details available at thirdplacebooks.com. And from Eco Design and Maintenance, family-owned and specializing in start-to-finish exterior design using materials and methods that help to reduce environmental impact. From landscapes to hardscaping, outdoor spaces designed to be functional and long-lasting. More at eco-seattle.com.
This is KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. We're streaming the show on YouTube. Imagine you could, at the end of the week, have a cup of tea with Publicola co-founder Erica Barnett and Gamoran Legal Consulting's Saul Gamoran and the co-host of KUOW's Meet Me Here podcast, Dyer Oxley. Well, you can, because that's kind of what we're doing here on the Week in Review. We're continuing on now with some of the events of this week, and there's a new state law that puts Washington crossways with the president and the Pope. This law, which Governor Ferguson has signed, requires clergy to report child abuse or neglect to authorities, even if the clergy learned about the abuse during the sacrament of confession. The Catholic Church in particular responded that any priest who complies with this new Washington law will be excommunicated. Seattle's Archbishop called the law, quote, a clear intrusion into the practice of our Catholic faith. And the U.S. Justice Department says it's opening a civil rights investigation focusing on this law's, quote, apparent conflict with First Amendment religious freedom. Does anyone find this law to be an illegal violation of religious freedom or an unconstitutional religious intrusion?
If I could just ask a question, because I grew up around churches, nothing Catholic though, but so if someone could just clarify this for me. The abusing children thing, that's not part of the religion, right? I mean, that's not like anywhere in the Bible, correct?
Abusing children? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Will you restate that?
Children?
Yeah, that's not
There's
like
a lot
part
of stuff
the
in the
religion.
Bible.
Yeah, I'm just saying, because if it's not, then that's kind of like case closed. There's no conflict. You don't make a law respecting establishment of religion or free exercise thereof. But this is not part of that.
Well, this is about the clergy penitent privilege of privacy in the confessional booth.
You have a responsibility in that position. There's a lot of positions in our society that have that level of responsibility. Social workers, teachers, and so forth. And so I feel it's like totally in line and correct to just line someone else up, like a priest who has to do that, with the same exact responsibilities. It's just it comes with that responsibility.
So I look at it a little bit differently. I think, first of all, it is a clear intrusion, but I think it's worth doing. In other words, the First Amendment is not absolute. And I think I would carve it very narrowly, but when you're talking about the most vulnerable people in our society, like children that can't fight for themselves, I would overrule the Catholic Church's right for the sacrament of confession, which I have great respect for, and say, no, in this case, it needs to be disclosed.
I mean, I think it's not a great look for the Catholic Church in particular to be saying that child abuse is not something that they want to or should have to report, given their own history of child abuse, child sexual abuse, in fact. And also, I mean, I don't think that, to Dyer's point, I don't think that there is a protection for the penitent. What did you call it? The penitent?
Clergy penitent privilege.
Clergy privilege.
I think that's the term of art.
Is that actually
yes.
okay? Well, I guess I don't think that should be protected, but more to the point, I mean, in cases like this, but more to the point, I mean, I think human beings have a moral obligation to report when vulnerable people are being abused, neglected, particularly children, and that the Catholic Church would be fighting on this particular issue is just, I mean, I don't know what to say. It's pretty disgusting.
I had kind of the same thought too in the back of my mind, that at a time when the church already has decreasing membership, some financial problems, the potential for like backfire, bad PR from this is probably pretty threatening to that church right now.
I would give them a little more credit and say, look, they didn't do it for the PR. They have a view. The view is that the sacrament of confession is holy, and they think it is more important than preventing child abuse. I happen to disagree with them.
Did it strike you as anti-Catholic, as I'm trying to remember exactly who called it anti-Catholic. I heard that
the Catholic Church by any chance?
A lot this week. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't want to put it in the mouth of Seattle's Archbishop, but there were claims that this was particular. Oh, maybe J.D. Vance, maybe the vice president,
who joined the Catholic Church 2 minutes ago and has a lot of views that do not comport with the Catholic Church's views on various things. But go on.
Okay. Well, I think I have my answer. Another thing that surprised me about this is that there are 7 states that have laws like this that do not recognize the clergy penitent privilege, because it's not just Catholics who do this, some form of confession. And that, according to my authoritative Google search, I say in quotes, the U.S. Supreme Court has not directly weighed in on these laws. New Hampshire and West Virginia and others, they have these laws. And so I wonder whether this Washington state law will be a test case that in this administration will rise to the U.S. Supreme Court.
I think we know the answer to that, Bill. The answer is yes. It's going to go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, when looking at these kind of stories, you do have to you have to look at the impact, and what the impact is if clergy are keeping it secret when people say they are abusing children. The impact is that those children will continue to be abused in the same way that they are currently being abused. And so that is a choice that a clergy person, is now allowed to make. And I just think we should think about, what the impact ultimately is if this is protected and if they are allowed to continue not reporting child abuse.
You know what none of the state laws require? They don't require the priest or the clergy to identify the confessor. Do you think they should? That would be another step farther down the line.
I mean, they don't have to. I'm not familiar with this area of law. They don't have to say. They just have to say someone have reported child abuse against.
Yeah, the priest would not have to say this is. Well, in the Catholic Church, which is not the same as in all religions, the priest is not even looking. Is not theoretically doesn't know who's confessing. But in any case, the law does not require. Which I could imagine a law that does. You've heard a report of child abuse. Tell me who was that told you that, so we can follow it up. And this law doesn't do that. Anyway, that's what I know. Anything else?
Yeah, I think mandatory reporter laws generally require you to say, there's abuse happening by this person upon this person. So of course that should be required. That's the only way to get justice in cases like that, or to pursue justice and investigate them.
Well, no state's doing that. This law is set to be implemented in late July, unless, as we say, the courts get involved. Let's talk about another new law that Governor Ferguson has also signed. This is limits on rent increases in Washington. This new law caps annual rent hikes at 7% plus inflation, or 10% total, whichever is lower. State Senator Emily Alvarado said this is long overdue.
This policy is a good start to rein in housing costs, prevent homelessness, and make communities more stable.
But some landlords and developers say if there's less money to be made in housing, there'll be less housing. And also, it's not fair to a landlord who has expenses to meet. What do you think?
I mean,
effective, just?
I think that a 10% or 7% plus inflation cap is very, very high. So I don't think that it will necessarily have that much impact immediately at a time, when rents are somewhat stable, particularly in Seattle, where, it's the most expensive city in the state. But I also think that, if you, as a renter, I will say if my rent went up 10% every single year, and it was compounded every single year, rents can go very quickly from $2,000 to, $3,000 or $4,000 at that rate. That is not something that happens to people with mortgages. Your mortgage costs, your taxes may go up, but they don't go up like that. And I think there's, perhaps some misunderstanding among folks that don't rent how impactful those rent increases can be on someone's ability to live in a city where they work.
So I think we should give people who don't rent more credit. I think they understand the issue. They just disagree. So I don't agree with the law. First of all, it's not fair. 38% of rent is paid by people for single-family homes, and that's exempted from the law. Why is that? Why are apartment people paid that are protected and not people who rent homes? That just seems ridiculous. But second thing is, I think that it goes totally against free enterprise. I think people should be able to raise their rents. And by the way, people do raise mortgages. They're called adjusted rate mortgages or ARMs. And so mortgages go up too sometimes if you choose to take the risk of a short mortgage.
The difference is that renters don't really choose not to be able to afford houses.
Well, that's true, but that has nothing to do with the issue. The issue is that the renters will do a 1-year lease or a 2-year lease. And at the end of that time, if the costs go up or the prices go up, the landlord can raise the rent. In this case, he or she is limited to a certain amount, which I understand. But what it's going to do, it's going to put a chilling effect on the industry because people will want to, it's going to be less profitable.
So the question is, I want to hear from Dyer, but just... We don't have a law or oppose a law just because there's any downside, right? We're balancing a downside a chilling effect, let's say, against the benefit, according to the supporters, that some people's rent increases are going to be capped. So how do you know that's not a worthy trade-off, especially in a place where, as Erica said, it's hard to afford to live where you work?
Well, I think the market will adjust and it'll build low-income housing that people can rent. But in terms of the trade-off, I guess the trade-off would be that more people can afford their rent versus landlords being able to make more money. Is that what you're suggesting the trade-off is?
Does that sound right?
Well, that sounds to me like what you're saying, and I guess I would say I don't agree that that the government should have the invisible hand and direct landlords not to raise their rent.
Dyer?
Well, okay, well, at the end of the day, I think it sucked to find housing around here before the rent cap, and it's still going to suck to find housing around here after the rent cap. Either way, though, Saul, you brought up a point, and I don't know if you can explain this to me, but I've yet to hear anybody clearly explain to me how limiting rent increases also limits housing supply, makes things more expensive for people.
And I'll just interject that there's, I believe, a 12-year exemption for new development, so that would not apply in new developer housing.
Well, you want me to give the argument, or you want to do it yourself?
Go for it.
Well, I think the general argument is that if if you limit the ability of a landlord to increase their rent, they would say to cover their expenses, then they're not going to want to provide this housing. They're going to want to take that off the market, and that over time, the fewer housing units we have, that's going to act as an upward push on rents.
Exactly, and I'll go a step further. If you really,
meanwhile, you are reducing the rent increases for those who are covered under the law.
Correct. Yeah. But I would say if you really wanted to make an impact as a practical matter, you would go up against Airbnb. I live on Vashon Island, and so many people have converted their extra rooms and their houses to Airbnbs, and so renters can't afford to live on Vashon Island. They have to commute to Vashon to work. So that really has an impact. And
so you would lean on that private market
if
of
I were
Airbnbs?
Well, aren't those generally single-family houses that would be exempt from this, or smaller? I think it's 4 units or less that are completely exempt.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is, if you really wanted to have an impact, that's what you would do. I'm saying that I don't like going after the people who have worked hard, built a home, went and built a mother-in-law's apartment. Now they're exempted. Well, they're not going to be exempted for long. I just don't think it's fair.
I think it's possible to hold two thoughts in your head at the same time, though, because I don't think Seattle has always been the best with landlords here historically. I speak as someone who lived in what I call a unicorn apartment, aka a speakeasy apartment that you probably shouldn't tell the city about, because they have had these regulations that just made it difficult to rent those rooms out in people's households. They've mended that in recent years and made things a little bit easier. But at the same time, this law would never have even come about if it wasn't for person after person. You ask anybody, you can go out in the street right now and just ask somebody, has a landlord raised your rent to the point where you are out on the street next month? It's just happened time and time. It happened to my wife when we first started dating. And then she covertly moved into my apartment. But it just keeps happening again and again. If that was not happening, we would just never have seen this law happening. So it just seems to me like that was the more pressing need, to cap that, to handle that first. And we can still handle all this other stuff. There's over-regulation, if there's opening up things with Airbnb. Let's still go after that. But we at least got to cap off this problem first.
Yeah, and I just want to point out in Seattle, which is the most expensive place to live in the state, we do have pretty strict Airbnb regulations. So the local government did take care of that issue in a way. But I would also say, the invisible hand of government, I guess, in this case, Saul, it does do all kinds of stuff to regulate landlords' properties. You have to meet the building code. You have to have a habitable place to live. There's lots and lots of regulations that are there for the protection of renters. And, and this is another one that, has now passed statewide. But I think it's, we're never going to have a quote unquote free market for housing where you can just rent out a tent in your front yard to somebody for $1,000 a month, because, we have protections for the 60% of people in Seattle who are renters. And so, I just, I don't know. And then on the question of affordable housing, I mean, the market doesn't build affordable housing, but if Seattle did, or the state did decide to invest in a huge amount of housing for low income people, most of us are renting in the market. The vast majority of people will always be renting in the market. And that does not mean that they can afford their housing. And so what happens for most people is, we end up paying 50% of our income, 40% of our income or more on rent, and are not eligible for affordable housing or can't get into it because there's a huge wait list. So I just think that, we have to consider the real lives of people who are faced with the choice of moving every year, which is incredibly destabilizing, particularly for families, or paying, just bigger and bigger percentages of their income as rent. And I think that outweighs any sort of hypothetical landlord claim that they're going to get out of the market.
Well, wouldn't you all agree that if they do raise the rent and it's too expensive and the person moves out, they're doing it because somebody else is going to pay that fee? So there is a market for that, or they wouldn't be able to raise the rent.
That's true. Let me hit this from another angle, though. This is a business, and if you do care about the economy, if you do care about business, business likes stability, business likes predictability, and workers are part of the business model. And if you have an unstable working force, if you have an unpredictable working force that has to keep moving further and further and further out of Seattle with no reliability to get back in, this is a risk to the local business market. So establishing housing for the folks that can come into your bars and cafes and your hotels and handle that, I would argue, is still a value that we can add.
All right, well, the legislature agreed, and this cap on rent increases is set to expire in 2040. So think of it as a 15-year pilot program. By the way, unless you're a mobile homeowner, that's not going to expire. It's a 5% cap. We're a little over time, so let's take a break so we have a time to get all our favorite weekly stories in before we have to hug goodbye. We're going to take a break. Be right back.
KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. Let's talk about you for a minute. We recently asked for your support during Public Media Giving Days and Give Big, and you showed up big. Because of your generosity, KUOW can keep delivering the independent news and storytelling our community counts on. Thank you. We truly couldn't do it without you.
Support for KUOW comes from the Real Estate Finance and Development Group at Ryan Swanson Law. Lawyers contributing to the development and redevelopment of multiple properties and real estate projects in the Northwest. More information at ryanswansonlaw.com. And from Duration Health, emergency medical kits for earthquake preparedness, international travel, and outdoor adventures. Duration Health kits include prescription-only medications like antibiotics and EpiPen, prescribed in advance by a physician. More at durationhealth.com.
Okay, we're 3/4 of the way done with KUOW's Week in Review this hour. I'm Bill Radke. We've got Saul Gamoran, Erica Barnett, Dyer Oxley, and let's get to as many interesting topics as we can. The richest philanthropic foundation in the world is headquartered in South Lake Union, and we now know in 20 years it will close, according to its co-founder. Bill Gates says he'll give away 99% of his fortune to the Gates Foundation. They will spend it all within 20 years, and it'll shut down earlier than planned. The main reason, he says, is that when you know you're done in 20 years, then instead of focusing on just keeping this foundation breathing forever, you can decide now what's doable. If we made a giant push, let's, get a handle on tuberculosis and AIDS. Let's eradicate polio, malaria. We'll see what they can get done. But 20 more years at the Gates Foundation, what was your reaction?
I'm a little worried. It only leaves him with a little over $1 billion left.
99% of Gates,
that wealth.
Yeah, leaves him with only $1 billion to spare.
That's really sad. I hadn't thought about that.
I actually was thinking about, I don't know why, just all the jobs this is going to... I know we're talking about 2045, but I think the last estimate I saw was around, more than 2,000 people that the foundation employs. That, you take that out. I don't know if they're phasing down or not, but that does affect contracts, employees, let alone the research that the company or the foundation's involved in. So other than the, hey, this is a great donation aspect of this, I kind of wish it would have been set up so that the foundation can continue after, Bill Gates is gone, and that this kind of charitable outlet can keep on going.
He said once he's gone, he would, I'm paraphrasing, basically you don't know how their priorities are going to change. Is it going to be what you would have wanted it to be?
Yeah, I think that kind of gets at the issue that a lot of people have raised with this kind of noblesse oblige sort of donation, or this basically with the idea of foundations deciding based on the interests of their founder. I think Bill Gates said that, he was reading Nicholas Kristof columns and deciding based on that he wanted to focus on child health around the world. And that is a very good cause. But if anyone who's tried to get money for even a small grant for something, knows that it's very difficult because you have to sort of tailor it so that the founders and the people who are giving you the grant will give it to you. And it's based on what they want. And, I think
philanthro-capitalism,
as it should be.
And in a just world, I think that we would have a society that pays for these things through our tax dollars and has the right priorities. And we would not have to rely on, the largesse of a kind of benevolent capitalist dictator of a foundation. I'm not saying that their giving has been bad for the world, and I'm being somewhat facetious.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is a problem when we're relying on charity to decide what problems are important in the world.
Yeah, Saul, in a sense, didn't Gates say something similar? He said people were not paying attention to tuberculosis. Why? Because it's in these poor, countries. There is this charge that you're nursing the global sufferers. You're not fixing the underlying reason for their suffering.
Right, and I think it's terrific what he's doing, and not just going to give away interest, but he's going to give away the principle and really make it. The next 20 years are going to be tremendously impactful. I think it's great news.
Okay. I'm making time for other announcements this week. Dyer, what is a Lime glider?
A Lime glider is not a moped, but almost. It's essentially...
it looks like a bicycle.
It looks like a bicycle. There's no pedals. It's essentially a scooter, but you don't stand up on it. And this is the next big thing in Seattle. They tested these in Seattle already over last summer, and they said it was so good. They're going to keep them going. Honestly,
first city in America to launch these publicly shared gliders.
If I was to put a tinfoil hat on my head, right, just put the tinfoil hat on, I would suspect that the Lime gliders could replace the stand-up scooters that we have in town that nobody seems to be able to use properly and is all over the sidewalks.
I almost got run over while I was standing outside.
When I was coming in here, there was a UW student going down the street, holding up cars all behind them. So it's like, okay, you're not doing it right in the street. You're not doing it right on the sidewalk. Harborview is seeing injuries go up and up and up. Nobody's wearing a helmet.
Why is a glider better?
I think people might feel a little more comfortable being in a bike lane if you're in something that looks more like a bike. I rode one of those scooters once when I needed to get from someplace and it didn't want to take an Uber. I was going down a hill and I was just in the middle of this ride thinking, this is a terrible idea. This is not good for me and it's not good for anybody. I'm hoping I make it through this trip. And a glider, I don't know the physics, the arguments. Yeah, I went to public school. Sorry, but I just feel like it might be a safer option than a stand-up scooter. I mean, I think that anybody who has ridden a bike versus being on one of those scooters, and I use the scooters, they are an expensive but convenient way to get around. You can just tell it just feels safer. I mean, you've got two big wheels underneath you. Now, I don't necessarily want to introduce another fast type of transportation into, faster than bikes, for example, into shared lanes where I like to run. And we already have kind of a menace of people, with essentially motorcycles going 30 miles an hour. But I think these will, since they're city regulated, they'll be speed limited. And it does 15 just miles an hour.
It just feel safer.
Saul, I picture you on a Lime glider. Am I right?
That's how I came here today.
I assume. Okay, well, good luck to the gliders, and we'll see how all that works out. Hopefully the fewer injuries. Erica, in the city of Seattle, the city council's debating. Right now, a city councilor is supposed to recuse themselves, meaning not take a vote on an issue where they've got a conflict of interest. They stand to personally benefit from the outcome of a vote. Some city councilors are saying, no, we should get to vote as long as we disclose the conflict of interest. That's transparent enough. What do you say?
Well, Kathy Moore, City Council member Kathy Moore, has proposed legislation that would get rid of the recusal requirement, which has stood for decades and is rarely used, by the way. It doesn't come into play very often. And it would replace it with a disclosure requirement where they would have to say during both votes, the committee vote and the main council vote, that they have a financial conflict of interest, and then they can vote anyway. Yeah. And I think that's a big difference. I mean, you're going from essentially the most restrictive option that is available to the least restrictive option. And, and I just, the timing of this has been called into question. The council has some landlords on it who might be forced to recuse themselves on an upcoming vote on some changes to landlord-tenant law. Landlords like the changes, tenants don't. And so there's a question about the timing. But I think, in a larger sense, I mean, this will change the city's ethics laws and weaken them, in perpetuity or until a future council changes them back. Okay. And that's a big decision.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we're coming to the end of the show. I just want to express the objection, which is, let's say I voted for a city councilor because they're a small business owner. They know business. I want them to vote on business laws and taxes, and even, that's why they're there. If they can't vote, I don't get the city council I wanted. That's the argument.
Yeah, well, they would be able to vote. I mean, unless it was something that would be a direct financial conflict for their business. So,
well, if they're a small business owner, they have to recuse themselves, like what's her name did?
Tanya Wu.
Yeah,
so,
that's not true. It was a specific type of business that she owned, which is a restaurant that used DoorDash, and it was on a proposal that related to gig delivery workers. And
let's say I want Tanya Wu. I voted for her. I want her to vote on the DoorDash question. Am I being disenfranchised if she can't vote?
That would be the city council's argument. No one in the public has made that argument, and I would say there is no constituency for this proposal other than city council members. I have not heard that argument come from anyone except for city council members who are promoting this legislation.
Okay, so I'm a member of the public. Yeah. I support the change.
It just happened. He just objected.
There's one person now who, no, I support the change.
Okay. What?
Why?
Because of what I just said? Or
Because what you just said, and I think also the way to correct it is to vote people out of office. If you don't like them, get rid of them.
Okay.
Well, again, this is almost never used, and it has primarily been used in the exact situation that they're about to vote on when people have been landlords. So it is used very judiciously. So it's not like people are being prevented from voting very often at all.
Okay, what's the next step, Erica?
They're going to be, it's going to be back in committee. They're going to take a committee vote. I don't know the exact timing on that, and then it goes to full council.
All right, we're getting toward the end of the show. Some headlines. This week, a colleague asked me if there are any Bartell drugstores anymore, and there are dozens, but I understand the question because the one right next to our office is gone and lots of are gone. Well, they might go away. Their parent company, Rite Aid, is going bankrupt again and says it'll close all the Bartells if it can't find a buyer. How'd you react?
Oh, it's a shame. I love Bartell's. I've been going there ever since I came to Seattle in 1984. It's a shame.
Did you call it Bartell's even back then, or is that a recent thing?
No, it was always called Bartell's as far as I know. Was it called something else?
Well,
it's like Pike's Place Market.
Yeah. Okay. So it's Bartell drugs, but many times people put the S on, right? It's very common.
I've never heard anyone call it Bartell. Have you?
I call it Bartell's.
I call it.
Yeah.
You call it Bartell's. No, I am the only one left, but I am not a scolder about it. I came, and when I moved here, I looked at the store and it said Bartell on it, and so I call it Bartell. But yes, Erica.
I mean, I just agree. It is a shame. I liked the eclecticism of the stuff you could buy there, but also, I mean, I think it's part of the problem of pharmacy deserts that every neighborhood in the city and around the country is experiencing. I mean, there's just fewer pharmacies to go to.
Yeah. By the way, Pike's Place came up on Jeopardy this week. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here you go.
If the 1960s plan to replace this Seattle market with high-rises had succeeded, there might be no Starbucks today. Dan.
What is Pike's Place Market?
No. Sarah or Michelle? Sorry, Dan. We are sticklers in Seattle. It's Pike Place, no S. Back to you, Michelle.
Ouch.
Burn.
Harsh. Yeah. I wonder if he would have taken Bartell's for a correct answer. Okay, Dyer, you reported on the new musical lineup for Bumbershoot. I recognize some names, which, given my age, could be a bad thing. I don't know.
Well, I think the big one is Weezer. I saw their Voyage to the Blue Planet tour that came through last year. It is one of the best things I've ever seen. And I don't know, if you don't listen to Weezer, I would question if you even like listening to sound. But it was an amazing concert. That alone, I was a big attraction to me. But there's some other big names in there too. One of them that I don't hear as many people bringing up is the Diggable Planets. Yeah. And I love that group.
Okay,
yeah.
But your larger point was Bumbershoot and music festivals, are they wobbly?
I think I noticed that they were teaming up with Capitol Hill Block Party for a Big Gulp ticket. No word on if 7-Eleven's suing on that one, but
I call it Big Gulps.
Yeah, they're trying to get more people to go to both of their festivals. There was another festival that was canceled in Seattle this year, and it just brought up this curiosity. I'm like, well, why are these festivals having such a problem? Have we reached like too many in this city, or is just the modern audience so into streaming and on demand that going to festivals is kind of a foreign concept?
This might come up on KUOW's Meet Me Here podcast. I don't know, right? It might. Dyer's a co-host of the Meet Me Here podcast. Seattle's getting a new area code. Your current area code will not change, but in a month, you can start getting assigned a 564 when you get a new line.
Oh, good. That'll be another way for the true Seattleites to put people on the outs.
That's exactly how a colleague of mine reacted. He said, wait, I don't want to wait until next year to buy my kid a phone because she won't have a 206 area code. I said, well, who cares? And he said, there's a status to having a 206.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why, since everybody's on their cell phones and you just hit up whoever you're trying to call, but that's definitely still true.
Yeah, 360 represent.
Okay. Doesn't having an old area code mean you're old? Why is it status worthy to?
Well, in Seattle, anybody who's been here longer is better, right?
No, aren't I worse because I've lived here a long time? Doesn't that make me lazy?
We like making cliques and gangs, and that you use a umbrella. You say Pike's Place. We just love doing this, for some reason.
I don't. Okay, we got like a minute left. What made you smile this week, if anything?
Well, Pope Leo is a White Sox fan. That's awesome. We're going to see him throw out the first ball at a game this year or next year.
Not a Cubs fan?
No, he's from the South Side.
Okay. It's controversial.
In Chicago it is.
Yeah, I know.
This isn't really exactly a smile, but I finally got around to watching Adolescence, which is a 4-episode miniseries about a kid in the UK who kills a girl, and things ensue from there. And it is gripping, incredibly upsetting, but really moving, and the acting is great. And
the accents are non-pareil.
I mean,
the Manchester or whatever that is.
Fully have to put on captions.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's really great. I would highly recommend it.
Yeah.
This is totally selfish. Sorry, but I saw my kid on a sonogram recently, and he actually looks like a person now. Not a little less blobbishy, a little more person-y. So that was pretty cool.
Congratulations! Yeah. Welcome, Dyer's kid. I'm going to add a Seattle author winning a Pulitzer for her first book.
Oh yeah.
Tessa Hulls wrote a graphic memoir called Feeding Ghosts about 3 generations of Chinese women and their experience of handed-down trauma. Again, Feeding Ghosts, Pulitzer Prize, that's a big wow.
It's on my shelf at home.
Is it?
Yep.
Okay. Well, take it off and read it sometime. I hear it's good. Okay, and finally, I smile every time I see the following. Publicola co-founder Erica Barnett. Thank you for coming. And Seattle Nice podcast.
Thanks, Bill.
Right? Dyer Oxley, KUOW's online editor, producer, co-host of the Meet Me Here podcast. Really dug the emo episode.
Thank you.
It reminded me of the time when I was a young boy. My father took me into the city to see a marching band.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He said, son, well...
There was a parade there.
This conversation got weird. Saul Gamoran, founder, president of Gamoran Legal Consulting. Thank you, Saul. Good to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm Bill Radke. Zeki Hamid produced the show. Bernard Willett running the board. And we got Hans Twite and Juan Pablo Chiquiza, a great team around us. And we'll see you next week.